Good evening, everyone. My name's Toby Simpson. I'm the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. This is a special occasion. It's a book launch in partnership with the Association of Jewish Refugees and the Insiders Outsiders Festival. And I often feel excited about events at the library, but this really is a special one. And it's a pleasure to see so many of you all here with us in attendance and to have so many people joining us online. Of course, the pandemic has been a terrible, difficult time for so many people in so many ways. But one of the few positives to emerge has been the rise of technologies that allow us to connect to one another across large distances. And we've got many people joining us internationally this evening, which is fantastic. So I just want to extend a heartfelt welcome to everyone who's joining us, whether that's from Aberdeen or Australia, from Wandsworth or Wyoming. It really doesn't matter. It's a pleasure to be hosting tonight's event and to have you all with us. I know you'll be looking forward to hearing from our speakers as much as me, and I'll be brief, therefore. But I do want to say a few words about this unique library where we're hosting the event. The Wiener Holocaust Library is one of the world's a handful of truly comprehensive libraries of record of the Shoah. But it's more than that as well. It's unique because it started actually in the 1920s and was therefore an institution collecting evidence of Nazi crimes even as they were happening. And in that sense, it really is unique. It was founded by Dr. Alfred Wiener, who was a German Jew from Berlin, and he dedicated all of his energy and powers at first to try and stop the Nazis coming to power. And when that proved impossible, Alfred Wiener relocated. He left Germany for Amsterdam as a base of operations to try and warn the world about the threat posed by the Nazis. In 1939, the library moved to London. And it was around that time that the Association of Jewish Refugees started as an organization in the UK. And the AJR coordinated activities to assist tens of thousands of Jews who had been forced to flee Nazi Germany. Very early on, the AJR actually worked closely with the library. And in fact, it even helped us to build our collections. And so the partnership between the Wiener Library and the Association of Jewish Refugees is decades in the making. And I'm proud to say it continues now stronger than ever. I'd like to thank our partners for this event, starting with Michael Newman, the Chief Executive of the AJR, but also the wonderful team. I'd like to thank Deborah Barnes, Susan Harrod, Bea Levkovitz, Alex Moores, several of whom are here tonight. The team at the AJR have always made the Wiener Library team feel like family, and we so much enjoy working with you. Long may our joint endeavours continue. So coming to the library's collections, the collections here document the lives of thousands of extraordinary people, in particular Jewish refugees. And there's a poignancy to these collections. They showcase incredible diversity, amazing experiences, terrible experiences, but they also show an astounding cultural, social, intellectual brilliance. And that's across a huge different range of fields of activity like photography, the arts, the sciences. And so that's one of the reasons that we're delighted to be partnering tonight with the Insiders Outsiders Festival, which has showcased the contributions of refugees from Nazi Europe in Britain. And I'd like to thank the creative director of the Insiders Outsiders Festival, Monica Bohm-Dutchen, who has helped us to bring this event together and has used her own creative brilliance to ensure that that festival has been such a huge success, despite all of the difficulties of lockdown and the pandemic. So I just want to congratulate the Insiders Outsiders Festival and celebrate the fact that we're working in partnership with them today. So this brings me to tonight's event itself. We're hearing tonight about a very special book which has just recently been published. And this is Deborah Cadbury's The School That Escaped the Nazis. For the first time, people will be able to read a comprehensive, carefully researched account of this amazing school and its history, which features first-hand testimony, letters, diaries, and present-day interviews. As many of you know, Bunce Court was not just any school, it was a haven for successive waves of children fleeing persecution. And it was set up by a remarkable woman, Anna Essinger, a pioneering educationalist. The school that she initially started in Germany, near Ulm, was moved in its entirety to Britain, and it was that place that became a haven. Like the founder of the library, Anna had read Mein Kampf and recognized in it the danger posed by the hateful ideology that Hitler was espousing. They recognized that danger much earlier than their contemporaries. It's one of the things that's remarkable about both of them. And indeed, this amazing book was researched in large part using the collections of the Wiener Library. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so delighted that Deborah's here tonight to launch this amazing book in this special place. Before I introduce Deborah and our other speakers tonight, I do just want to take a moment to note that tonight's online audience includes several people, in addition to our speakers, who I think it would be good to just welcome with special warmth, because they, of course, have a special relationship to this story. There are several Bunce Court alumni, essentially, in our online audience. And in fact, we also have a Bunce Court alumnus here today. I do also want to mention that the Bunce Court alumnus who I knew best is sadly no longer with us, and that's Professor Leslie Brent. And he was a very, very special person to the library, to the AJR. And I just want to express how much I miss him and how glad I am that his family, many members of Leslie's family, are here with us this evening. One thing that some people viewing or here might not know is that Leslie was instrumental in ensuring that a blue plaque would be unveiled at the site of Bunce Court. And that was unveiled in July of 2018 in a wonderful ceremony. And I'm very delighted that that happened. And we're joined in person also by, Julia Miller. My apologies, I lost myself for a second there. Julia Miller, who was instrumental in bringing together the Bunce Court reunions and hosted many of them. So really special welcome to all of you. So just to mention some of the former pupils of Bunce Court who are joining us online: Anna Rabkin and her older brother Arthur, Sidney Finkel and his daughter Ruth Wade, Carl Grossfield, Mia Lewis and Helen Kotler. Welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us this evening. Many of these individuals feature in Deborah's book, as you might imagine, and you'll hear more about that from Deborah herself shortly. Our programme this evening will be as follows. We'll be hearing a talk about the book, and after that we'll have the special privilege of hearing directly from a former Bunce Court pupil, Ruth Boronov-Danson, who's here with us this evening. Welcome, Ruth. Ruth escaped Nazi Germany in 1939, aged 14, and she'll be assisted this evening by her daughter, Jacqueline Danson. So after hearing from Ruth, we'll then be hearing from Evan Oliner, who is the grandson of former pupil Sam Oliner. And it's actually Sam Oliner's story that opens Deborah's book, The School That Escaped the Nazis. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Evan. It's my pleasure also to note that several other members of the Oliner family are joining us online. So it really is, as I say, an amazing coming together of people who the Bunce Court story touched in various different ways. So there we are. To begin proceedings, it's my pleasure just to say a few words of introduction about Deborah Cadbury, the author of the book. Deborah has written several acclaimed books in addition to this one, including Queen Victoria's Matchmaking, Princes at War, and The Lost King of France. The accompanying TV series to her book, 7 Wonders of the Industrial World, received a BAFTA nomination, and it was also a Sunday Times bestseller. Before she turned to writing full-time, Deborah worked for 30 years as a BBC TV producer. She's won numerous international awards, including an Emmy. So with that introduction, I'm sure you'll be as excited as I am to hear what she has to say. And you can join me in welcoming Deborah Cadbury to begin tonight.
Here we are. Thank you very much for that. Can you hear me? Good. First of all, good evening and a very warm welcome to everybody. And thank you to Toby and all at the Wiener Library for hosting us, along with the Association of Jewish Refugees and Insiders Outsiders, and also to so many who are part of this story and here today joining us online, the former Bunce Court pupils and their families, without whose powerful contributions I could never have written this book. Before we start, the other thing I want to say is that for me, this story matters. It's not just a story about a far-sighted headmistress and the escape of an entire school and its very courageous pupils. It's also a story for our times about why democracy matters, why freedom of thought matters and cannot be taken for granted, why it has to be considered and fought for, as Anna Essinger did. So this all started for me when I met former pupil Leslie Baruch Brent at a Kindertransport commemoration in London. Here he is, circled, an anxious-looking boy of just 13 on the first Kindertransport out of Berlin, with no clue what the future might bring. So I'm particularly delighted that we've got his family here tonight, including his wife, Carol, and his daughter, Jenny. Leslie first told me about Bunce Court and I was intrigued. I'd studied this era and not come across a secret exodus of an entire school from Nazi Germany. And Leslie spoke with great emotion. It was clear that for him, this story stood for so much more than just a school, as he began to talk about the woman at its heart, the head teacher, Anna Essinger, or Tante Anna. She's quite a character, looking somewhat formidable here in her double lens glasses to help with her poor eyesight. This is the woman, as one previewer put it, I thought rather the enabling act transformed Hitler into Germany's all-powerful dictator. And here are a couple of street scenes that give an idea of the feel of the times. Nazi forces parading in front of Hitler in 1933. And here, boys and girls were indoctrinated in Nazi ideology through the Hitler Youth. And within days, the archives show that Anna was ordered to fly a swastika over her school at Herlingen. Outraged, she staged a one-woman protest and hastily organized a 3-day camping trip for her students. Only when the school was completely empty did she hoist the flag. It's hard to say whether it was the swastika incident or everything else that happened leading up to that point that prompted her decision. Many at the time were saying, Hitler won't last, people won't stand for it, this will all blow over. There were all sorts of comforting theories, but for Anna, a line had been crossed. For her, it came down to one core issue, and she didn't leave many records, but in the one short record she left, she felt that Germany was no longer a place in which to bring up children in honesty and freedom. Honesty and freedom, that was the key for her. She wanted to be able to teach the truth, and she wanted freedom to question, to challenge, to live without fear, freedom of spirit. In Hitler's Germany, lies were being turned into truth. Black was being turned into white. How could she possibly teach the next generation if under a Nazi dictator she couldn't speak the truth without fear? But there was a tracer at the school who denounced her to the state educational authorities. In a chilling letter, Helman Speer, the husband of one of the teachers, expressed serious doubts about Anna Essinger. Her rather airy-fairy humanism, as he put it, was altogether uncongenial to National Socialism. And since many of the teachers at her school were Aryan, he said, and he mentioned at least one who joined the Nazi party, he hoped they could join forces to change the school and urged that a Nazi spy be placed there who would be prepared to come to an understanding with those members willing to cooperate. Well, we don't know whether Anna knew that she was denounced, but we do know that by this time her secret plan to smuggle her school out of Nazi Germany was well underway. There was a huge amount at stake. Obviously, mass immigration was prohibited. Her sister Paula wrote in her memoirs, we had to avoid all suspicion. If the Nazis learned that Anna was planning to remove a whole school from Germany, they could have put insuperable obstacles in her path or imposed punitive financial sanctions. And of course, if the press got hold of the story, it would cause a sensation. The school could be seized by the Nazi Party or requisitioned by Hitler Youth. They could lose everything. But to move her pupils abroad, Anna had to involve others, the parents, the teachers, and the children. And the dangers of opposing the Nazis were escalating very fast. In late March 1933, Hitler's government quite openly formed the first concentration camps where you could be held without trial. Dachau, of course, and closer to home, Hans-Jörg Griemel, who's joining us from Germany and who's done so much to raise the profile of Anna Essinger in her home country. He told me that the Heuberg army barracks, not too far from Ulm, were converted into one of the very first concentration camps, holding 2,000 of Hitler's political opponents, including a local MP and 3 priests. So Anna soon learned that prisoners were held indefinitely there without charge and suffered inhumane beatings. The legal system, as well as democracy, had gone in Germany. Anna would also have heard of the arrest of one famous educator, Kurt Hahn, founder of the acclaimed Salem School. He had been open about his opposition to the Nazi Party and was put in jail. He would incidentally later go on and form Gordonstoun in Scotland. The British Quaker, Corder Catchpole, was the first Briton to be arrested in April, prompting questions in the House of Commons. He'd shown support for Jews who'd been targeted by the Nazis. His crime, the Gestapo told him, was to make insufficient effort to understand our great national revolution, a very similar charge to the charge against Anna. People were disappearing off the streets, but Tante Anna wouldn't allow fear to interfere with her plans. She was combing Europe, searching for a new location for her school, before finally finding a favorable reception in Jewish and Quaker circles here in London. At last, there was people who understood what she was talking about, and they were prepared to raise funds and try to help her find a site for her school. Back in Germany, she held secret gatherings for the school's parents, where the response was overwhelming. More parents signed up than children we could take with us, Paula wrote in her memoirs. It took a great deal of secret planning, and there were many setbacks. In fact, as Anna and her staff were finalizing their escape, Hitler himself came to Ulm with the Nazi leadership on their very doorstep. It was as though the city of Ulm was suddenly engulfed in collective madness, a vast throng in the famous church square to hear Hitler. It would only take one person to betray them. Hitler's convoy passed directly through Herlingen village, not far from Anna's school, little knowing of the small rebellion in planning just a short distance away. Well, everything came to a head on the 5th of October, 1933, the momentous day of the escape from Nazi Germany right under the noses of the Gestapo. Anna's most trusted staff was spread out in 3 teams across Germany. Parents were making their way to pre-assigned railway stations along 3 key routes out of Germany with their children. Language teacher Hannah Burgess was leading a group of children across northern Germany. The religious affairs teacher was leading a second group, discreetly picking up a child at each station along the Rhine, while Anna's sister, the school nurse Paula, was setting out from Munich, also collecting pupils on her route. And of course it was frightening. Anything could happen. A child could accidentally give the game away. They'd prepared the children for this moment, but they knew however much the young ones wanted to help, they could still forget. And it was equally possible the Gestapo had already pieced together the plan and could stop them at the border. Now, I don't want to spoil this for people who haven't read the book. And I have been asked to talk only for 35 minutes, and I want to get on to the pupils, so I'm not going to tell you how she did it. Just to say, after all the horrors and tensions of the journey, there was that magic moment when the school was reunited and crossing the English Channel. There on the quayside in Dover was Tante Anna, with 3 red buses waiting to drive the children through Kent. And the buses came to a standstill in front of a rundown but once gracious English manor house, Bunce Court. And it was soon clear by the whoops and screams of delight from the children that this was the real thing. They were in England and they were safe. And what a place to be safe in, a sort of school palace, this old English manor house. It wasn't long before she and the children decided the school must have a new name. It would be called after historic buildings, Bunce Court School. But their trials were only just beginning. There was a constant shortage of funds and in turn, no domestic staff. Anna tried to turn this to their advantage, resulting in key differences between how Bunce Court was run compared to the original school. Anna had always put practical learning on the same level as academic achievement, but now the practical tasks became essential to running the school. Everyone contributed like a big family. Here they are feeding the chickens. This is a carpentry lesson, and they were repairing the building. Music, I'll talk about music more later. It's very important in the school. There was also a very strong emphasis on integration. Anna realized it was impossible to know what the future held for her children, but she tried to give them the tools to make their way in Britain or elsewhere. And they had some very unexpected challenges, not least an entire saga with stuffy British school inspectors who took a dim view of this German school with no money, which rapidly had more animals than children because they were growing their own food. They didn't believe that Germany would continue to export children, as they put it, and they thought the school wouldn't survive. And we found marvelous records of the school inspectors, which give a real idea of their refusal to even come and visit the school. But when they did in 1937, there were some unpublished comments, and I'm going to read you one because it's about Tante Anna. The headmistress is a most capable woman and fine character. Driven from two countries, America and Germany, for political reasons, she betrays no thought of complaint on her own account, but gives herself entirely to work for the children and the school. She's large-minded and philosophic, but also practical and can deal with large problems and small details. She reigns in a calm, undemonstrative way over the entire establishment, including 6 men teachers, 4 of them English, and all appear loyal to her. So they were obviously completely won round eventually, and she never saw these comments. Now, of course, the refuge that Anna created at Bunce Court soon reflected the escalating catastrophe unfolding on the continent. There were successive waves of children arriving at Bunce Court, and they mirror what was going on in Nazi Germany. The first wave tended to be the children of left-wing intellectuals who were the very first target. But with escalating persecution, there were more and more applications from Jewish parents. And, in the field of education alone in Germany, leaving aside everything else that was going on, all that Anna had foreseen about having to teach lies had come about. German state schools had rapidly become an entire thought world of Nazi ideology. This is an illustration from a Nazi-inspired book for younger children, Trust No Fox on His Green Heath and No Jew on His Oath, showing Jewish children taunted by so-called Aryan pupils as they're expelled from German state schools. Here, 2 Jews have been summoned to the front of the class, and on the blackboard is written, "The Jew is our greatest enemy, beware the Jews." In fact, the entire curriculum was subverted. History became a struggle between races, with Germany's enemies identified as the Jews. Geography was taken over with Nazi ideas of living space. Biology was all about so-called race science. Here we see a teacher demonstrate alleged differences in face shape to his students. Even religious instruction didn't escape the new ideology. And this is a quote: "Hitler has been sent by God to the German people," one headmaster allegedly announced at school assembly. And any school teacher who dared reveal their disagreement risked arrest if they and could be reported to the Gestapo. Jewish children like Leslie Brent were vilified in school in a multitude of cruel ways. In fact, Leslie was driven from his school. His father, in despair, sent him to a Berlin orphanage. And of course, the persecution for the Jews just gets worse and worse in the 30s. Children arriving from Germany by the late 1930s had seen their families impoverished and abused, their parents imprisoned or even killed. And then during 1938, the crisis spread to Austria and then Czechoslovakia. This is a scene from the Anschluss, prompting a further wave of refugees. And then we get the brutal pogrom on Kristallnacht, it's called, in which 30,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps. And it's estimated the death toll was well over 1,000 Jews killed that night. And this leads to the next wave of children who arrived at Bunce Court, including Ruth Boronov-Danson, arriving at Bunce Court age 14. And here we have Leslie, who was among 10,000 children who came on Kindertransport. All he could think of was when his parents would join him. He felt he'd almost internalized the endless denigration. I took it for granted as fact, he says. And this is little Mia Schaff with her siblings, Mia in the middle. Mia told me after Kristallnacht, her mother locked them in their apartment. They were so frightened, but the terror was just overwhelming. The locked door wasn't enough. They were always listening, though they didn't know what for, and that made it worse. It was July before her mother, Ida, managed to get 8-year-old Mia and her sister Alice on Kindertransport, and her son John on one of the very last Kindertransports. Ida finally got a visa and was due to leave Germany on September the 10th. One of many parents who made promises to their children that they would come. But of course, in September 1939, with the start of the Second World War, children like Leslie and Mia were cut off from their parents in a wholly unpredictable way. The 25-word Red Cross messages proved a precious lifeline. And at Bunce Court, Tante Anna and her team were facing escalating challenges. By late May 1940, the children were horrified. The Nazis were practically at the door. The Germans were at Calais, just 20 miles away. And with the school an absolute passionate hotbed of anti-Nazi feeling, came a series of bombshells. One morning, the British police came to arrest all the male German teachers and boys over 16 who were deemed enemy aliens and to be interned. And then, to everyone's outraged astonishment, they came back a week later to take away the beloved cook, Gretel Heitscher, and some senior girls. Then Tante Anna was given just 3 days to get Bunce Court out of the manor house. It was requisitioned by the army. And again, you get a real sense of Tante Anna's character in a crisis. While other teachers were despairing at the idea of a second exodus, as Leslie put it, here was this by now semi-blind woman herring round the country, trying to find a place for us to live. And she succeeded. The countries of Europe were falling one by one. By the 10th June, the day Norway surrendered and Mussolini declared war on Britain, Tante Anna had all her pupils over 16 on a bus to Shropshire, away from any risk of being arrested by the British police. And 3 days before France fell, the whole school was taking lessons as normal in their cramped new quarters here in Trench Hall in Shropshire. But Trench Hall was very dilapidated and much smaller than Bunce Court, and they'd left behind their entire flock of 500 chickens and a herd of pigs and all their carefully cultivated veg. And with all the difficulties at Trench Hall, even Tante Anna seemed to reach a low point. That we survived that summer is still a wonder to me, she put in her memoir. And of course, the whole world became caught in the conflagration. During 1942, pupils started to get ominous Red Cross messages from their parents, saying that they were going on a long journey. Leslie's father had always started his message, beloved, geliebter boy. But in October 1942, he told his son they were going on a journey. No forwarding address, and the beloved was written in capitals that were wildly uneven, as if he could hardly hold the pen. Anna could only do her best to comfort Leslie, but they guessed the truth. Word was spreading of mysterious deportations of Jews from Nazi-occupied countries, and those parents that were taken were never seen nor heard from again. The approach of the teachers to this new horror is shown by a comment by one popular housefather, Hans Mayer. My God, as soon as Leslie's letter arrived, a hush fell. Of course we knew about the camps, he said. You didn't say to the children, your parents are in concentration camp and will be killed. You tried to help them through the times of silence until they got used to the fact that no more letters would come. You got them used to the silence. There isn't time to do justice to the teachers' valiant efforts to fight on, doing all they could for the children. Reading the archives, I got a real uplifting sense of their fighting spirit, and there were marvelous and unexpected breakthroughs. For instance, under government rules, friendly enemy aliens were being released from internment, and Tante Anna lost no time in snapping up staff of unparalleled caliber. There was one lovely moment when the school had a new boiler and stoker man, William Markwald. As he stoked the boiler, the children were surprised to hear him singing. They gathered round the stokehold in amazement. Who was this star attending to their boiler? He had the most wonderful tenor voice. Word soon spread that the new boiler man, who emerged from the dirty stokehold singing so beautifully, was the former director of the prestigious Deutsche Theater in Frankfurt, and soon he was directing all the school plays. The new maths master turned out to be a famous astronomer, Mr. Archenholt, and the new music teacher, Greta Hirsch, had perfect pitch and enchanted the children by annotating birdsong. There's so much I could say about the heartening story of how they all pulled together to make it work, but I'm going to jump to after the war and the liberation of the camps, when the whole world could see the scale of Nazi evil and depravity. Incidentally, one story from former pupil Harold Jackson at this time shows how little was still understood about what was going on. Tante Anna happened to have made a block booking for her pupils to go and see Laurence Olivier's Henry V in the local cinema. And she got a call from the cinema manager telling her to cancel the booking. The cinema was also showing Pathé of Bergen-Belsen. It took Tante Anna a moment to grasp that the manager wasn't concerned for her children. The film was stirring anger, and he feared there would be trouble if there were Germans in the audience, which shows you how little the situation was really understood. Tante Anna would offer refuge to a final wave of students, the orphans who'd survived the war in Nazi-occupied territory. There were very few ways a Jewish child could survive in Nazi-occupied Poland, which had turned into one vast prison for Jews. But I was able to trace 3 former pupils who survived in quite different ways before they reached Bunce Court, such as little Sam Oliner here. Here he is, aged 15 at Bunce Court. But Sam was just 9 when the war began, 12 when he witnessed the brutal liquidation of his ghetto and lost his family. Sam had the incredible courage to hide in plain sight, posing as a Polish stable boy. He faced terrible risks as Jews were literally hunted down and suffered appalling near discoveries. There just isn't actually a word to do justice to the fear and trauma that all these survivors were subject to. Sam is a central character in the book, and I don't want to say too much more about his story because Evan's going to tell us in a minute. But Sam's story does help shed light on how the team at Bunce Court tried to help those who'd suffered unimaginable trauma. Tante Anna and her team realized that the kinds of things the survivors had been through couldn't be talked about. To talk about it was to relive it, and that was just unbearable. But Sam told me one of the techniques they used to help the children was a mentoring system where not just the teachers, but the children helped each other. And Sam was invited to mentor Sydney Finkel. Here he is, just after leaving Bunce Court, another Polish survivor. Sydney was just 7 when the war broke out. He and his family were herded into Poland's very first ghetto at Piotrkow. And Sydney too endured the murder of almost all his family and the liquidation of the ghetto, but unlike Sam, survived the war within the concentration camp system. Just how much was taken from Sydney, how much he was made to participate in Nazi evil and depravity, is revealed by one appalling memory that he has from this time, a chance encounter with his father, Lieb, at Buchenwald. Sydney had reached the point where he had so internalized the twisted Nazi point of view that he could no longer behave like a normal son. Lieb was skeletal, unrecognizable from the father he'd once been. but his dulled eyes lit up when he saw his son, and tears streamed down the parchment yellow skin of his face. He stretched out his arms to draw his son into a tight embrace and gave him his last piece of bread. But Sidney felt terribly awkward. He loved his father, but could no longer behave like a loving son. He turned his back and silently walked away. As Sidney put it, the child he'd once been just didn't exist. He thought like the SS guards. Old people have no right to live, he thought. They were taking precious food from the young. It was his last meeting with his father and prompted literally decades of torment. Who was I, he wrote later? What kind of animal had I become in the camps? When he arrived at Bunce Court, 14-year-old Sidney describes uncontrollable feelings of loss and rage. He thought he would never belong. Aggression could flash to the surface from nowhere and he'd fight. And he vividly recalls Sam's kindness and how Sam guided him. For instance, Sam broke up one fight explaining to Sidney, no, you can't do that, and trying to help him see that the very behavior that had helped him survive was now holding him back. Sidney remembers many instances where Aunt Anna helped him, and I won't go through them all here, I've run out of time, but she convinced him that she cared. And Sidney was also one of many who emphasized how music also helped him. Music was the soul of this school, he says. When people couldn't get through to him with words, they could with music. It was part of daily life at Bunce Court, and he loved it. He began to learn the piano, and as he mastered his first pieces, it felt incredible, he remembers. One Friday at the end of his second year, Sidney was able to take center stage and play a short piece by Mozart in front of all the others. And he noticed Aunt Anna sitting nearby in tears. The savage part of Sidney was becoming civilized. This is an inscription Sidney wrote later on the back of a photograph to Sam, my friend. At the time, it felt astonishing. In spite of everything, he had a friend. It was just the beginning of a very long journey of recovery. And finally, this is 12-year-old Anna Rose on her way to Bunce Court from Poland after the war with her older brother Arthur. Anna had been just 3 when the war began, and she'd survived in a totally different way to Sam and Sidney, the only way girls could really survive, in hiding. After escaping the ghetto at Lemberg, now modern-day Lviv in Ukraine, Anna and Arthur had endured years in one room in terror of the Gestapo inspections. In the 1940s, very little was known about extreme trauma, and Anna Rose remembers vividly being told to forget all the bad stuff that had happened to us, as she put it. This was a new day and life would begin all over again. And since we'd been spared, we had to live a life that would make our parents proud. That's what they were told. And it seems brutal to us today when so much more is known about trauma. But the fascinating thing is that it seemed to work. Aunt Anna aimed to create a homeschool where these traumatized orphans would feel secure and loved. And the children responded. Years later, pupils would refer to the Bunce Court spirit that enthused all their efforts and pervaded the atmosphere. For them, the school seemed to stand apart, an oasis in a world that was overwhelmed by the forces of Nazi evil. I treasure those years, Anna Rose said. It was transformative, and she pointed out she can't understand why more schools aren't run on a similar basis. And here are some images from Sam's collection, Happier Times at Bunce Court. And Sidney too found he was changing. Aunt Anna was very loving, he says. I began to belong in Bunce Court. It was a wonderful thing. Leslie perhaps sums it up. All the violence I had experienced before felt like a bad dream. It was paradise. I think most of the children felt it was paradise. Anna Essinger herself didn't live to see the huge success of her alumni. By the time she retired, she was almost completely blind. This is Frank Auerbach, pictured here at Bunce Court, who went on to become one of Britain's foremost modernist painters. Leslie Brent was part of a team of immunologists under Peter Medawar, who won the 1960 Nobel Prize. Richard Sonnenfeld became the Americans' chief translator at Nuremberg and went on to lead the team designing computers for NASA's lunar landings. the playwright Frank Marcus, the filmmaker Michael Romer, the impresario and raconteur Gerard Hoffnung, the journalist Harold Jackson, the filmmaker Peter Morley, and many, many more. Her words and deeds echo down the decades and still have something to teach us. In Russian schools today, children are taught world peace lessons in which they learn how Putin's special operation is protecting Russia from the Nazis. Even the youngest Russian minds can be indoctrinated just as they were in Germany. One BBC report described a primary school picture book featuring a story in which a Russian schoolboy is rejected by his Ukrainian classmate, who's now friends with an American boy. Such repressive measures highlight the Kremlin's increasing attempts to control young minds, just as we've seen before. With rising numbers of refugees worldwide, Anna's school is an intriguing model for our times and reminds us why freedom of thought matters and must be fought for. Without it lies oppression and fear. More than this, her simple message to her children still stands. She gave the children so much more than an education: tolerance, appreciation of another's point of view, respect, love. These are the freedoms that counted to her and that she dedicated her life to fighting for. Some have called Bunce Court a second home, observes Megan Ryan, the wife of a former pupil. It's more than that. It's a way of life, a state of mind. Aunt Anna has made a great achievement.
Thank you, Deborah. That was a wonderful talk, absolutely fascinating. I'm going to ask you in a second to just bear with me while I adjust our audio to hear from our next speaker. But before I do, can I just let everyone know that there will be an opportunity to ask Deborah questions at the end, because I'm sure lots of you will have thoughts and questions that they'll want to share. If I could just ask you to hold on until we've heard from our next speakers. We're next going to hear from Ruth Baronoff-Danson, who was there. So if you give me just one moment, I will adjust the microphone.
Okay, you start. It is an honor to speak to you about my old school, Bunce Court. Thank you all for your interest in it.
I have the fondest memories of my time there because of the exceptional skill, love and dedication of the staff.
I was born Baronoff in Breslau in 1924.
I had a blissful childhood there as an assimilated German Jew, but that all changed. One day when I was 12, returning home from playing in the local park, I chanced upon a cavalcade. Just across the road from me, standing out in an open-top car, Adolf Hitler was parading by.
I was terrified. I tried to make myself invisible behind a pillar. I felt obliged to blend with
Blending with the crowd.
Blending of the crowd and by rearing my arm in the Heil Hitler salute.
This was a new mandatory sort of assimilation for which I have felt guilty for the rest of my life.
Out on the streets, I was frightened. Anything could happen. You did not know a soul, not a soul. They could do anything.
On Kristallnacht, night of the broken glass, my mother had sent me across town to warn a friend that my father, dentist Ernst Baronoff, had been taken to Buchenwald concentration camp. A condition of his release a month later was that he take his family out of Germany on a one-way ticket, leaving almost everything behind. At home, he'd known Lotte Karlischer, the music teacher at Bunce Court. So when I arrived in the UK in March 1939, I joined the school on her recommendation. I'd like to share with you a few memories from that time, based on the 70 or so letters I sent my family during those years.
So when I got here, I have to confess that in Germany I was never keen on school. So when I got to England, I declared I want to go to school.
This posed an interesting dilemma for Bunce Court, who wisely supported me in gradually coming to my own decision. They had me stay in the nearby house, Kenneways, where some other girls at the school boarded. Each morning, I saw those girls bust off to the school laughing, whilst I was left alone with the housekeeper, who put me to work cleaning the windows and doing other mundane tasks. In the evening, the girls would return with exciting tales of everything they'd learned. So it was not very long before I decided that going to school was after all preferable. I wrote to my parents in May 1939, still in German, "Daddy, you are somewhat right in your suggestion that I first had the idea of going to school because I didn't feel I fitted into the household, but hardly thought that I would think all the time, I must make a success of it at school because I want to learn something."
Yeah. I will have to do schoolwork in the rest hour, but I will make a huge effort. Hopefully, sometime it will be that my side in the early days as that would make things a bit easier.
And indeed, the school was steadfastly at my side to the extent that just 4 months later, I was writing to my parents.
Today, I want to find out about French. I had to definitely like to be included in the French class. Do you remember how I sat at home in the dining room and with bated breath awaiting Daddy's promise that I would not have to learn French? That shows just how much I have changed.
A letter described an early encounter with Tante Anna, who was known as TA. To tell the truth, I was a bit scared of her, not least because of a superficial childlike fear of her very thick glasses. I wrote.
You wrote?
You wrote.
Hier, Tante Anna lief mir heute 4-mal in den Weg. Schrecklich.
In English, I bumped into Tante Anna 4 times today. Ghastly. But I quickly came to realize how extraordinary she and the environment she was creating for us to thrive in were. The teachers taught by offering positive encouragement. TA never called me in to come and see her to tell me off, only to praise me. A letter to my parents early on, written in my best Jinglish, describes a typical day and how the care of us as individuals, practical considerations, and formal learning were always artfully blended.
Now I'll try to tell you my day today. We had lessons with open doors. In mathematics, we made things which I don't know. In biology, we took auseinander a rabbit and the Bauch,
Yes,
Bauch and took out all the Eingeweide. It was very interesting. In history, we went to the open air theater. You know it, don't you? And there we played the Entwicklung of a war. I haven't understood anything. I'm proud.
No. And yet a postcard sent to my father in September 1949, referring to my matriculation exam, says,
I passed. Imagine that. Really, I'm still quite pale and trembling, but Tante Anna just came in and brought the news. She even gave me a kiss and said, I'm especially glad about you, Rose.
In a short period of time, Tante Anna's uncompromisingly aspirational vision for how her pupils had enabled me to surprise everyone, including myself, and had brought out the very best in me. That was her loving gift to each of us in her charge. We were discouraged from speaking German, even amongst ourselves in our leisure time. TA felt it was part of our duty in becoming British citizens to speak only English. By June 1940, I was writing to my parents.
We speak no German word anymore. What a very pleasant
Speak no German word anymore, what is very pleasant.
Yeah. So now.
One moment. Even lunchtime, when teachers and children joined hands, was used as an opportunity for reinforcing our sense of opportunity and social responsibility towards others. And Tante Anna would say,
children love one another, and if you are not able, if that is not possible, at least respect each other.
In June 1940, when the school was evacuated from Kent to Wem in Shropshire, a complicated moral dilemma arose, which again was handled with TA's characteristic wisdom and empathy. My mother, Kate Boronoff, a piano teacher, had just been freed from internment in the Isle of Man and had moved to Wem to be near me. We asked Tante Anna if Bunce Court could find her a position, as she had been able to for some enemy aliens. Tante Anna thoughtfully explained to us.
No, she said, we could not do that. Today, no. To have you with your mother here would not do the other children any good.
Mutti then found a position at a nearby school in the village, where I was allowed to visit her with the TA's permission, which was given only sparsely for the reasons she had explained. But thanks to her, we fully understood, without any resentment at all, how important it was that we played our part in supporting the other children. Despite the horrors going on in the wider world, which inevitably also touched all of our lives forever, the school had lovingly taught us the social awareness, resilience, resourcefulness, and gave us the skills and spiritual strength to thrive in our new lives.
I will always be most grateful to Bunce Court for the difference those much treasured years have made no way
Made to my life.
Made to my life.
So now we're going to hear from Evan Oliner.
There he is. I think this was the one. Yep. Great. How's my sound in the back? Is wonderful. Okay. So with apologies to the virtual attendees who I'm told are numerous, and include some of my family, right? I'm going to address the room because you all made the journey. So yeah, my grandfather is a child of the Holocaust, Samuel Oliner, and he's also a pupil of Bunce Court. And today I wanted to just tell his story and maybe put Bunce Court in that context and just in that way frame this one contribution that Bunce Court made, because he has a beautiful legacy. And I don't know that it would have been the case were it not for this amazing moment in history that was Bunce Court. An interesting aspect of his wartime experiences are that they were kind of preceded and followed by a period of relative peace and even a somewhat idyllic period. I mean, with the tragic exception of his biological mother's death of tuberculosis when he was a boy. His childhood seems to have been relatively peaceful, and I've been to his childhood village of Zindronowa in the south of Poland and explored the surrounding area, and were it not for the tragic contrast of the mass grave in Garbacz Forest where his family now lies, it would seem like some kind of an eternal paradise. And so that in mind, it must have been a special kind of hell for him with the Nazi invasion and his family's eventually being moved to the particularly brutal Bobowa ghetto. And they're there until August 1942, when the Gestapo come through to liquidate Bobowa ghetto, as Debbie alluded to. And so as they're moving around and loading residents of the ghetto onto trucks, his stepmother implores him, and this quote, lives on in his memoirs, and he always remembered it, simply, you must live. You must live for us. And so he hides on the roof, and he is potentially the only survivor, although I don't know if that's completely true, of the Bobowa ghetto. And so after this, you can imagine a 12-year-old boy, unspoken horrors already behind him, and he's wandering the countryside in what must have been a kind of adrenaline confused stupor. And he eventually arrives at the house of a Balvina Pirek. And this is a woman who figured heavily in his salvation and his overall story. She was a friend of his family and his father who they'd had some dealings with before, they'd worked for her. And she essentially facilitates his going undercover as a Gentile farmhand for the remainder of the war. And as you might expect, this is no simple task. There's many things one must do to keep that cover alive, one of which is to speak Polish as a Gentile farmhand would without the Yiddish accent. Another is to not let anyone under any circumstances find out that you are circumcised. And an important one was to memorize the Lord's Prayer, which Balvina helps him do. That's an anecdote that comes about a lot. And as Debbie also alluded to, this period is rife with many close calls, near discoveries that would have led to his elimination. And one thing that always permeates my thinking about this is that would have led to my elimination. This is a recurring theme in my thoughts about his life, is that to save someone is to save their entire progeny, is to save potentially generations of potential. And that's why Bunce Court is such a meteoric event. It's not some kind of feel-good tale. As Debbie put it so pithily, it matters. And that's very true. So apologize for the digression, but the next 3 years of his life obviously brutalize him. They require lots of cunning, lots of savvy, and he muddles through. Several other survivors of the Holocaust in Poland help him get to Munich. And as an anecdote to kind of indicate his lack of exposure to the global world outside of Poland, the American GI that takes him to the displaced persons camp in Munich is the first Black person he ever saw. And this is just, his first foray into learning about the world outside of his small South Poland rural existence beforehand. So he is at this DP, displaced persons camp in Germany. And at this time, many people in these DP camps are encountering opportunities to go to Israel. And undoubtedly he would have considered this. But then he catches wind of the fact that the Jewish community of London, as he puts it, is arranging for Jewish refugees to go and finish their primary education in England. And so he goes that route and he ends up at Bunce Court. What follows is a period that, at least for me, has been to now relatively underdocumented. It's overshadowed to some degree by the horrors that preceded it. I only knew a few tidbits before encountering this book. He mentions that he was on the football team. He mentions that he used to sneak out as he got older to go to the girls' part of the school. But other than that, I think what really matters about this is that it was a kind of sweet and refreshing sense of normalcy and feeling like a regular boy. And I also am inclined to speculate that it matters that this safe harbor in his life was a school of all places, because my grandfather went on to have scholarship, academic inquiry, intellectual inquiry be the outlet through which he explored and obtained some level of closure with his trauma and his guilt. So him and my grandmother, Pearl Oliner, went on to become pretty renowned sociologists who forged or helped forge basically an entirely new literature in sociology of altruism. And they conducted a long-term, multi-decade study of the various correlates of altruistic behavior. And they went on to make that contribution. So yeah, Sam, my grandfather, he passed away last year. He's no longer with us. But why this story means so much to me is what lives on is his beautiful legacy. Bunce Court is more than something that has contemporary utility, contemporary wisdom. It actually continues to affect the contemporary world via these amazing people such as Ruth, who are still with us and whose children and their children will be with us. So I'm just so grateful to Tante Anna above all else, but also to Debbie for telling this story and to you all for coming. So thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Evan. So we now have some time for questions, either from the audience here in the library or from anyone who'd like to ask a question from our online audience. So we have a first question here. If I could just pass the microphone to you.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm 90 years old now.
Oh, wonderful.
Sorry, sorry. Yes, you have mentioned it. God, how amazing. Anyway, thank you. That I'm going to go to Bunce bookshop tomorrow and order your book. It's the first thing I'm going to do. And thank all the people that have already talked.
You didn't say your name.
Yeah, I was born Gabriele Rosenberg in Berlin in 1932, January. And my father, Ludwig Rosenberg, was a classic scholar. And my grandfather, who sadly I never met because he died before I was born, was also a classic scholar, but his main interest, which Howard forgot when he wrote about my grandfather in AJR, that is, grandfather Felix's main interest was English. And I've got the entire works of Shakespeare, little temple books with Felix Rosenberg written inside. And he came to England, Felix did, every year to make sure his English still sounded all right. And he wrote postcards back to my father and the family in Berlin. And after my father died in 1954, I found these postcards and I'm bringing them to Howard next week sometime. And he can have the postcards, but I'd like copies of them. And they're written in German. But luckily, Felix wrote in the Latin script, so I can easily read it. I mean, I do speak German, but I can't read the special German script, you know, the Gothic. I can read Gothic print, but not the Gothic handwriting. It's too complicated for me. Anyway, my father was asked by Anna Essinger if he'd like to come with his family and be one of the teachers at Bunce Court. So in March 1934, we arrived and I was 2 years old. And my mother was a trained Montessori kindergarten teacher, as well as a violinist, which is very important. And so there was a cottage. Have you mentioned the cottage in your book?
No, I haven't mentioned the cottage.
Oh, well,
no.
From the big house, if you, to a little 2-year-old, the field looked enormous because there's the garden around the house and then there's a field, and in one corner of the field is a cottage.
Yes.
And we lived there, and Mum had all these little children, you know, under 5, I should imagine. Yes. I must have been one of the youngest. And tell me when to stop, by the way.
Well, it's lovely that you just grew up there. You grew up.
No, not for very long. Such a sad thing. But the other children didn't have their mummies and daddies, so they didn't like me. So I was taken to live with Tante Paula, Tante Anna's sister, in the sick bay cottage, which was in the grounds of the big house. Yes. And that was fine. She was very, very nice, Tante Paula. Yes. But my parents weren't terribly happy, so they left and they didn't know what to do with me. Yes. So my grandmother, paternal grandmother, came and took me back to Germany.
Oh, no.
Yes, it's all right. Oh, no. My mother was terribly upset about it. Later.
What year is this?
1934, August. And my parents went to London, and Dad spent his time writing letters to schools all over England who needed a teacher who could teach Latin, Greek, French, and German. And in the end, to cut the matter short, Mum played the violin wherever she went, and she had a quartet. And in the quartet, the other violinist was Tess Simpson. Have you heard of Tess Simpson? She helped professional refugees find work. And she knew W.B. Curry in Devonshire, in Dartington. And Curry was terribly worried because his French teacher had just left. And these children all wanted to pass their French exams. So Tess wrote to Curry, Curry wrote to my father. I was in Germany. And Dad went down to Dartington for a sort of test term. All the children passed their French exams brilliantly. And Curry said to Dad, would you like to have this position permanently? And so my father became the head of languages at Dartington Hall School. So, and then he wrote to his mother and said, bring Gabriela back. I've found a job and I've got a flat in Totnes, South Devon, and we'll have our daughter back, please. So that's how that happened. And in the meantime, Mum had had both my brothers were born in England. My mother had had my brother Michael in a Jewish maternity hospital in the East End of London. So when we arrived in Totnes Station and all the way down with Granny from Paddington, I said, sind wir schon da? At every single station we weren't. And at last we were. And then my next terrible worry was, I was 3 by then, werden meine Eltern mich erkennen? Will my parents recognize me? Luckily, there was Dad on the station waiting for us. And we went to our wonderful flat. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Totnes in Devon. And there's one real Elizabethan house still. And it was owned by an old gentleman. I don't know if he was Jewish. He did wear a couple, but I don't know if he was Jewish. And he had this house and he let out flats. And we lived at the top flat. So that's, sorry?
What an amazing story.
So anyway, that's how we got to it. I came back.
Thank you so much.
Actually, Gabrielle, I'm not going to let you go quite so easily. What was it? Do you happen to know what it was about Bunce Court that your parents didn't get on with? Because I think it's quite easy. Am I right, Debbie?
Mum got on very well. And I wish I brought that photo. I've got a wonderful photo at home of Mum leading the orchestra at Bunce Court, and she had lots of pupils. So I have been back to Bunce Court. Not when it was a school anymore, with one of Mum's pupils, Elsa Schwabeker, who was a wonderful gardener. And when we got the house in Totnes, which we got for a house with 3-bedroom house, standing, not linked to another house, with a garden all round, for £5 a month. Can you imagine it? 1935. £5 was a lot of money. And Elsa came down and helped Mum do the garden. And years later, Elsa and I, kept in touch. And she and I went and had a look at Bunce Court. It was still a lovely house. And then I went again in 2018 when the plaque was, unveiled. And that was a marvelous occasion. So that was really good. Sorry, what else did you want me to say? Oh, why did my parents leave? I'm not sure. I think Dad got very unhappy there. He felt he couldn't really teach the way he wanted to teach. So that's what that happened. But in the end, he became a devoted Dartingtonian teacher. And lots of Dartington thoughts were the same as Anna Essinger's thoughts.
Yes, he was at these progressive schools at the forefront of things. He was at the progressive schools at the forefront.
Exactly.
Of things.
And the day children, my brothers and I, all the teachers' children could go there free, even though it was really a private school. So I feel so privileged. I've had so much luck and privilege in my life. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Wonderful.
Right. Very, very quickly, just on the back of the wonderful story about Dartington, I'm hatching plans with the creative director at Dartington, almost as we speak, for an event probably in the autumn of next year, to look for the first time really in any detail at the reception and the experience of refugees at Dartington. So if there were many more than I think anybody really knows or suspects. So if anybody has any stories to contribute, please come and talk to me later.
Thank you, Monica. Would anyone else in the room like to ask a question? Question here, sir.
Hello, my name is Daniel Lewandowski. Some of you know me. I've interviewed Ruth probably, was it now 6 years ago, I think. I think there was one non-progressive element. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more, which is that unfortunately Anna treated the girls differently from the boys. So it's no mistake that the boys are all the famous names. And if I can just make one comment why this was very important, and it's still very important to me, and thank you so much for researching this. We are in a state where refugees might be sent to Rwanda. This is a school on a progressive school model that proved that if you support refugees in the correct and right manner and give them the love that refugees deserve, there is no limit to the potential of and contributions of people that come over here.
Do you want to say something, Julia, about the reunion?
Well, just very briefly, my husband George and I and our family have lived in Bunce Court for 35 years, and our children obviously have grown up there. When we first moved there, we used to get a lot of people sort of peering over the walls, and just to let you know that the house is actually divided into 4 separate homes and was divided in 1980. So there are 4 different homes within Bunce Court, and you who've been there, Gabrielle, I remember you from 2018, and Carol and Jenny and various people who have been there, and Susan. But it has been a remarkable thing, and it's been a remarkable thing for us as a family to live in a house which we honestly feel has the love and the memories coming through the walls. And I remember a long time ago, and I hope Carol won't mind me saying this, but a conversation that Leslie, we were talking about somebody, it was Ingelore Weinberg when she passed away, and Leslie said, so many of my old friends and people from Bunce Court have gone, and that's it, and then it will be no more. And I said to him, Leslie, you and Ernst and everybody, Hans Meyer, everyone who is at Bunce Court will live within the walls. And it's true, it probably sounds mad, but it's the most wonderful feeling. But I would also like to end on a note that I have a friend who lives just down the road from me, and she runs the Lenham Heritage Society. And of course, Lenham was the station where a lot of the kinder transport children came to. And she runs this, and she said she contacted me a while ago and said that there was a proposal by Maidstone Borough Council for there's a lot of development going on in Lenham and in Faversham and all the way around, but they were proposing that 2 roads would be named after people who meant a lot to the area. And one of them was going to be Anna Essinger Road. They've now decided it will be known as Essinger Road because apparently the postman will find it difficult. But anyway, I just thought you would like to know this evening that Essinger Road in Lenham, which is only 5 minutes drive from where we live, will be there.
Well, fantastic news. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, Bea, did you have a question?
Hello, yeah, thank you for all your wonderful contributions. Congratulations on the book. Deborah, I have a question. I interviewed 20 years ago a woman called Lucy Schachne, who went to Herlingen, but when it became a Jewish school. So I wondered whether you have information how this Landschulheim then became a Jewish school, and she had a very positive experience there. And then she came to Bunce Court with her husband, who was a teacher. And she has many interesting stories about Bunce Court. One of them was that when the men were interned, she started teaching. So I think whether you know that about, what happened when the men were interned, did
Yes.
the women start teaching?
Yes, yes. Well, Herlingen, what happened was that in order to escape Germany, she didn't want to close down her original school. She wanted it to be used to help the Jewish community because she could see the way things were going. And so she put it about that she herself was going to be taking a sabbatical in Britain because she didn't want to give away that they were taking the entire school. But thank you. and was actually looking for a new headmaster to take over Hurlingham, because you were allowed to change the use of a school to turn it into a Jewish school, but you weren't allowed to open up a new Jewish school. So she was in the final weeks as she was trying to get ready for her exodus. She was also trying to recruit a headmaster for the old school and turn it into a Jewish school. And actually, I read the Lucy diaries. It is quite amazing, because Lucy was absolutely tormented in her German schools. She gives a really graphic account of the very first day when suddenly the school hall was just a mass of swastikas, and they were all having to sing the Nazi song. And she found herself joining in, and at the same time hating herself for joining in, and just couldn't bear the school and couldn't bear being at that school. And when she got to Hurlingham under Hugo Rosenthal, she just loved it. She just absolutely loved it, and really appreciated the Jewish education that she got there. So hers was a very interesting story. And she was also one of the very few, I think, who was able to train a teacher at a time when the Nazis were discouraging Jews to fully qualify as teachers. So she had a real fighting spirit, Lucy.
I wondered if you wanted to go back to the previous question about the difference between boys and girls at Bunce Court.
Yes, several girls did, several of the former girl pupils did mention this, that there was a kind of an awkwardness that they couldn't put their finger on. They felt that the boys were favoured, but there were also a large number of girls that loved it. So, you know, I can think of several that just felt immediately at home and made their friends. They were, I think some of them were intimidated by the way she looked, you know, those formidable glasses and everything. But yes, there were differences, I suppose, because at the time it was the boys that were going to go on, and, you know, this was a very, very, very different time. And the boys were going to have to go and make their way in the world. The women were much more likely to get married. That was just the way things were then. So I suppose it's, you know, we look back now and we think how dreadful, but actually at the time that was so much more what we all did. So I suppose that's how that came about.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Are there any in the room or online? Any towards the back? I see a question here.
Hiya. I just wondered about religious practice, and because I'm talking to a lot of kinder transport, they lose that when they come to Britain. But obviously it sounds like Anna would have done everything she could if they were observant at home to help them be observant in Britain. I just wondered if there was a synagogue they attended or anything like that.
No, not to my knowledge. I think anyone that wanted to pursue a particular faith, Judaism or anything else, would be encouraged and helped. But there wasn't anything that was, you know, properly organized or that everybody did together. It was run as a secular establishment. So I wouldn't say that, you know, I mean, this was actually, it was interesting because she was getting a lot of funds from the Jewish community, and yet she wasn't particularly encouraging the Jewish faith. So no, it was very much run as a secular school.
Any other questions? Okay, Alex.
Just curious how once the school was established at Bunce Court, how did they then recruit new pupils?
How did they get new pupils? Oh, they were just flooded with applicants. I mean, as the persecution was getting, you know, dreadful on the continent, you know, there were more people literally begging for places. Her phone was just ringing all the time. The difficulty was that, you know, the Jews in Germany were being impoverished to such an extent that a large number couldn't afford to pay. Now, the school council could afford for a certain number of pupils to come without, you know, being paid for. But in the end, she took as many as she possibly could. And I think the numbers swelled by about 50 or 60 at the time of kinder transport, reaching the maximum of 150 just as the war started. But funds were always a problem, because as it became more Jewish, as, you know, the problems developed on the continent, and they didn't like to turn anybody away or send anybody back, it was just a constant struggle. I mean, she was spending so much time raising money, and she would do that by lecturing or just every opportunity she possibly could. She was trying to raise money for the children. And I think the children, you know, caught up with this and got quite involved with this, because the open days were also, they took the opportunity because all their sponsors were there. You know, they were really lovely events. The children were all joining in and trying to show their sponsors all the amazing things that they'd done. And I do remember one note from one small boy. He'd been making little cutout animals to try to sell on the day. So even the little kids were trying to join in the fundraising. Everybody, you know, got involved in all of this. But yes, she just took as many as they could. And there was just a flood of applicants. And also they started to take English pupils as well. There were a growing number of English pupils.
Well, unless anyone has any burning questions, I'm going to suggest we end more or less on time at 8 p.m. And I'd like to think Anna Essinger would be proud of our Pünktlichkeit. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and especially thank you to our speakers and to Deborah for writing this wonderful book.
Thank you.
I'd just like to let everyone know you don't have to go to Daunt Books, because there are books on sale this evening, and they're £20, and I think Deborah's probably happy to sign some, possibly. Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, everyone.